police badge was clearly visible. To Maya, the uniform was a symbol of trust, justice, and protection. As she pumped gas, her thoughts wandered to the day's events, an exhausting sequence of meetings and paperwork that had left her drained. The sound of an approaching car broke her reverie. Turning slightly, she caught sight of a patrol car pulling into the gas station. The car's lights briefly flashed, and the officer inside stepped out with a determined gait. At first glance, she thought he might simply be refueling or taking a break. However, his expression suggested otherwise. Carter approached with a stern, almost confrontational look. His heart pounded as he walked toward her, each step fueled by his deep-seated frustrations and ingrained biases. From his perspective, seeing a black woman in a police uniform in this area so late at night was too much of an anomaly to overlook. "Excuse me, ma'am," Carter began, his voice sharp and authoritative. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Maya turned to face him, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his aggressive tone. "Good evening, officer. I'm just filling up my car," she said politely, gesturing toward the gas pump. Carter's eyes narrowed. "Do you have any identification on you?" he demanded, ignoring the fact that her uniform and badge were already visible. Maya frowned slightly but maintained her composure. "Yes, of course," she replied, reaching for her wallet. She handed over her police ID, which clearly identified her as Captain Maya Johnson. Carter barely glanced at the ID before handing it back, his mind already racing to justify his actions. "This area isn't safe, especially at this time of night," he said. "What's your business here?" "I appreciate your concern, officer," Maya replied evenly, "but as you can see, I'm a police officer as well. I'm simply stopping for gas on my way home." Carter's face hardened. He wasn't ready to back down. His frustrations and prejudices clouded his judgment, making him more determined to assert his authority. "Mind if I take a look around your car?" he asked, already moving toward it without waiting for her response. Maya stepped forward, her voice firm. "Officer, is there a specific reason for this search? I've done nothing to warrant such suspicion." Her question caught Carter off guard, but he quickly recovered. "Just a routine check," he replied curtly. Maya's patience was wearing thin. She understood the importance of routine checks, but she also recognized when an officer was acting out of line. "With all due respect, officer, there's nothing routine about this," she said, her tone steady yet authoritative. Carter hesitated for a moment, his confidence faltering under her unwavering gaze. He realized he had underestimated her. The calm yet commanding presence she exuded was unlike anything he had encountered before. "I'd advise you to reconsider your approach," Maya continued, her voice carrying the weight of her rank and experience. "Your actions tonight could have serious consequences." It was then that Carter noticed her name badge and fully comprehended her rank. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had just attempted to assert authority over one of the highest-ranking officers in the department. Stunned, Carter took a step back, his face flushed with embarrassment and disbelief. "Captain Johnson?" he stammered, struggling to find the words. Maya's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "Yes, Officer Carter," she said. "And while I understand the pressures of this job, I cannot overlook the biases that seem to have influenced your actions tonight. Would you care to take a seat?" Everyone in the crowd sat up, and the executive director's voice became. Carter lowered his gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of genuine remorse. His actions had not only been unprofessional, but also deeply unjust. Maya took a deep breath, her voice softening further. "We all carry our own struggles, officer." But it's important to remember why we wear this uniform. It's not to assert power, but to serve and protect all members of our community." Carter nodded silently, his mind reeling from the encounter. Maya's words had struck a chord, challenging the prejudices he had carried for so long. As she returned to her car, Maya couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. Encounters like this were far too common, even within the profession she had dedicated her life to. But she knew that change was possible, one conversation, one lesson at a time. Driving away from the gas station, Maya hoped that her words had planted a seed of reflection in Carter's mind. Meanwhile, Carter stood motionless, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on his shoulders. For the first time in years, he questioned the beliefs that had shaped his actions. Perhaps this encounter would mark the beginning of a transformation, not just for him, but for the system they both served. Carter's eyes wasn't about her actions, but rather his own insecurities and ingrained prejudices. His movements were deliberate, a performance of authority that seemed more for himself than for any legitimate purpose. Maya could feel the weight of his judgments, but she refused to let it shake her resolve. "Step aside," Carter ordered brusquely, gesturing to the front of her car. His hand hovered near his belt, an unsubtle attempt to assert dominance. Maya, however, remained composed. She had faced this before. Officers who mistook their biases for intuition, using their position to intimidate rather than protect. "Officer?" Maya said firmly, her voice steady but not confrontational. "Is there a specific reason for this stop? I'm in uniform, clearly on duty, and I don't believe I've given you cause for concern." Carter's lips tightened. He didn't like being questioned, especially by someone he perceived as subordinate. Not because of rank, but because of the color of her skin. "I'll decide if there's cause," he snapped, "and right now you're in a high-crime area at a suspicious hour. That's reason enough." Maya held her ground, her heart steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "With all due respect, Officer Carter, you're out of line," she replied, her tone unwavering. "This isn't protocol, and you know it." Carter's eyes narrowed, and for a moment his mask of authority slipped, revealing the frustration and resentment simmering beneath. "Out of line?" he repeated mockingly. "You don't get to decide that." He stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "This area doesn't need people like you acting like they're above suspicion. You know that." Maya's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. "And what kind of people would that be, Officer Carter?" she asked pointedly, her voice calm but cutting. "Law enforcement officers doing their jobs, or is there something else you're implying?" For a moment Carter faltered. The directness of her question caught him off guard, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "You're not the one asking questions here," he retorted, though his tone lacked its earlier conviction. Maya could see the cracks in his facade, the insecurity fueling his actions. She had encountered officers like him before, men who felt threatened by her competence and identity, who tried to mask their inadequacies with authority. She took a step forward, her presence commanding without aggression. "Officer Carter," she said evenly, "I've worked in this precinct for over a decade. I've patrolled this area countless times, and I've earned the respect of this community and my colleagues. I don't need to justify my presence here to you or anyone else." She paused, letting her words settle. "If you have a legitimate reason for this stop, then follow procedure. If not, I suggest you reconsider your actions." Carter's hand twitched near his belt, but he didn't move. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the authority in her voice with the image of the person standing before him. He didn't know who she was, not really, but something in her tone, Her composure made him hesitate. "I need to see some ID," he said finally, though his voice lacked its earlier bravado. Maya reached into her pocket and retrieved her badge, holding it out for him to see. "Captain Maya Johnson," she said, her voice steady. "And you, Officer Carter, are out of line." Carter froze, his eyes darting between the badge and her face. The realization hit him like a blow, and for a moment he looked genuinely stunned. The weight of his mistake settled heavily in the air between them. "Captain," he stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "Yes, Captain," Maya confirmed, her tone firm but not unkind. "And I suggest you take a moment to reflect on how you've conducted yourself tonight. This behavior is not only unprofessional but also unbecoming of the badge you wear." Carter's face reddened, a mix of embarrassment and anger flashing across his features. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Maya didn't wait for him to find them. "Officer Carter," she continued, "I've spent my career fighting for justice, not just for myself, but for every person in this community who deserves fairness and respect. What you've done here tonight undermines that mission, and it's a disservice to the values we're supposed to uphold." Carter lowered his gaze, the weight of her words settling on him. He muttered an apology, barely audible, before stepping back toward his patrol car. Maya watched him go, her heart heavy but resolute. As Carter drove away, Maya stood by her car, the adrenaline slowly fading. She had faced many battles in her career, but each one reminded her why she fought so hard. The road to justice was long and often grueling, but she wouldn't let moments like this deter her. Instead, they strengthened her resolve to create a world where no one had to prove their worth simply because of who they were. He kept his focus on Maya, but the presence of the recording forced him to recalibrate his approach. He took a step back, his posture stiff with tension. His eyes darted between Maya and Tom, as if weighing his options. The oppressive air lingered, though a subtle shift had occurred. "Fine," Carter muttered begrudgingly, shoving the first aid kit back into the trunk with little care. "But don't think for a second that this changes anything." His voice carried a bitter edge, a transparent attempt to reclaim some semblance of control over the situation. Maya remained silent, her expression calm but unyielding. She knew better than to respond to his provocations. Instead, she focused on her breathing, steady and deliberate, grounding herself in the face of Carter's disdain. She had nothing to prove to him, and she refused to let his actions rattle her composure. Tom took a step closer, his phone still aimed steadily at Carter. "You've made your point, officer," Tom said, his tone firm but measured. "Now, I suggest you let Captain Johnson go about her business. You've done enough here." Carter glared at Tom, the lines of frustration etched deeply into his face. "Stay out of this," he snapped, though his voice faltered slightly. The weight of being recorded had begun to chip away at his confidence. "This is a police matter." "It stopped being just a police matter the moment you started overstepping your authority," Tom shot back without hesitation. "And now it's on record. So unless you want this to escalate further, I suggest you stand down." Maya observed the exchange, her gratitude for Tom's intervention growing. She could see Carter's resolve wavering, though his stubbornness refused to fully let go. His hand twitched near his belt, but he hesitated, clearly aware of how his every move was being documented. Carter finally took a step back, though his glare remained fixed on Maya. "You got lucky this time," he muttered, his voice low but dripping with resentment. "Don't think I'll forget this." Maya met his gaze steadily, her silence a testament to her strength. She didn't need to respond to his veiled threats. Her calm and dignified presence spoke louder than words. Carter turned abruptly and marched back to his patrol car, slamming the door shut behind him. The engine roared to life, and with a screech of tires, he pulled out of the gas station, disappearing into the night. Carter strode toward the house, actively avoiding contact with the veranda as he moved along. Tom lowered his phone and approached Maya. Concern etched into his features. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with genuine care. Maya nodded, exhaling deeply as the tension began to ebb away. "I'm fine," she replied, though the weight of the encounter still lingered in her chest. "Thank you for stepping in. I don't know how much worse that could have gotten if you hadn't been here." Tom offered a small, reassuring smile. "You shouldn't have to go through that, Maya. Not here, not anywhere." She nodded, her gratitude evident in her eyes. "It's not the first time," she admitted, her voice tinged with both weariness and determination. "But it's moments like this that remind me why I need to keep pushing for change. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to endure this kind of treatment." Tom placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You've always been stronger than most, Maya, and people see that. Don't let this break you." "I won't," she assured him, her resolve firm. "I can't." Maya turned back to her car, taking a moment to collect herself. As she closed the trunk and slid into the driver's seat, she glanced at Tom one last time. "Thank you again," she said sincerely. "Any time," he replied, stepping back as she started the engine. As Maya drove away from the gas station, the weight of the encounter began to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced prejudice before, and she knew she would face it again. But she also knew that each time she stood her ground, she was chipping away at the barriers that sought to hold her, and others like her, back. The night was quiet again, but Maya's thoughts were anything but. This wasn't just about one encounter or one officer. It was a reflection of the systemic issues she had dedicated her life to addressing. And as the road stretched out before her, she resolved to keep moving forward, no matter how many obstacles lay ahead. Equal yet treated as inferior, his prejudices had been laid bare. He opened his mouth to speak but faltered, unable to find the words to justify his actions without exposing the fragility of his own arguments. The precious silence between the two men was fraught with danger. Maya held her ground, her posture firm and her gaze unwavering. She understood the gravity of this moment, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever faced such injustice. "This isn't just about me, Carter," she said, her voice steady, yet filled with quiet fury. "This is about the abuse of power, the systemic biases you perpetuate, and the courage it takes to stand up to people like you." Carter clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. His ego battled with the uncomfortable truth of Maya's words, and he could feel the weight of her resolve bearing down on him. He glanced at Mark, who stood silently by Maya's side now, his presence a quiet but powerful statement of support. "You're not untouchable," Carter finally said, his voice low and strained. The arrogance in his tone was diminished, replaced by an underlying frustration. "Neither are you," Maya shot back, her voice like steel, "and it's time someone reminded you of that." Tom, still filming, stepped a little closer. "This ends now, Carter," he said firmly. "The department doesn't need more headlines, and neither do you. Do yourself a favor and walk away before you make this worse." Carter hesitated, his eyes darting between Maya, Mark, and Tom. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. What had started as an attempt to assert dominance had turned into a battle he was losing on every front. Maya moved into the center of the room, stopping him dead. With a reluctant sigh, Carter stepped back, his expression hard and unreadable. "Fine," he muttered, his tone laced with bitterness. "But this isn't over." "It is for now," Maya replied, her voice calm but unyielding. She watched as Carter turned away, retreating to his patrol car without another word. The oppressive tension began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of victory. Mark stepped closer, his face filled with both relief and guilt. "I should have spoken up sooner," he said softly, his eyes meeting Maya's. "I'm sorry for hesitating." Maya nodded, her expression softening slightly. "What matters is that you're here now," she said. "We all have to decide when to stand up, and today you chose to." Tom lowered his phone, giving Maya a reassuring nod. "You handled that with more grace than most would have managed," he said. "This footage will ensure accountability, if it's needed." Maya let out a deep breath, the adrenaline finally beginning to subside. "Thank you, both of you," she said. "This isn't just about me, it's about ensuring that no one else has to go through this." The three stood together for a moment, the weight of the confrontation still heavy but tempered by a shared sense of resolve. Maya knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be reports to file, meetings to attend, and undoubtedly more battles to face. But for now, she had won a small but significant victory. As the night wore on, Maya reflected on the encounter, her determination only growing stronger. She had stood her ground, refused to back down, and confronted prejudice head-on. It was a moment that would stay with her, a reminder of the resilience it took to challenge injustice and the power of unity in the face of adversity. Carter felt exposed, the mask of arrogance he had worn for so long slipping away. Deep inside, he wasn't sure his actions were justified, but the pressure he had suppressed for so long finally became apparent. The confidence he projected had always been a defense mechanism, a shield against his own inner insecurities. But facing Maya, someone who embodied fairness and strength, that shield cracked, and the truth began to seep through. For a long moment neither spoke. The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the distant sounds of the night. Maya's gaze remained fixed on Carter, unwavering, while he struggled to hide the turmoil inside him. The tension was palpable, and he could feel the weight of her eyes pressing down on him, a constant reminder of the wrongness of his actions. Maya knew that this was the moment to take a stand, not only to highlight the racism she had just endured, but to prove that justice, in the end, would triumph over malice and arrogance. "No one can treat me like this," she said firmly, her voice filled with determination. "No one can view me as a criminal just because of my skin color. I will not let this go unacknowledged. I will not remain silent. I will never bow my head." Carter's self-confidence faltered as her words hit their mark. His attempt to maintain control slipped away, and he felt exposed, not just for his actions, but for the deep-seated biases within him that were now laid bare. His voice, once strong and commanding, was now smaller, weaker. "Captain Johnson," he said, his apology reluctant but clear, "I was wrong. There was no reason for me to act like that." Maya paused for a moment, her silence allowing the weight of his apology to settle. "Your apology is noted," she replied, her tone measured. "But your actions still need to be addressed. I hope you learned from this." Carter, without another word, climbed into his patrol car and drove away, leaving behind an atmosphere charged with significance. The situation, although far from over, had shifted. Maya had not only asserted her position, but had also made it clear that injustice would not go unchallenged. As Carter drove off, his voice still lingering in the air, he muttered, "If you want to make a big deal out of this, fine. We'll see." But before he could get far, another police car arrived. It was Mark Wilson, a colleague of both Maya and Carter, who had been observing the scene from a distance. Mark's expression was serious, his concern evident as he stepped out of the car. "Enough is enough, Carter," Mark said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Maya felt a sense of relief wash over her as Mark approached. While he wasn't usually the one to speak up in such moments, he was always there when it counted. His arrival was a turning point. Carter, already on shaky ground, seemed to falter under Mark's steady presence. It was clear now, Maya was not alone. Mark's mere presence was enough to affirm that Carter's actions could not be allowed to go unchallenged. Both Maya and Carter turned to look at Mark, and in that moment Carter realized he had no more room to maneuver. His wrongdoings had been witnessed, and now he was forced to face the consequences. Mark didn't need to say anything more. He simply stood beside Maya, a silent but powerful witness to the confrontation that had just unfolded. In that moment, Maya realized the strength of unity. She wasn't just standing alone in her fight for justice. The presence of Mark and the support from others like Tom, who had been recording, reminded her that there were still good people within the police community who would stand with her. Maya stood tall, her gaze sharp as she looked at Carter, who, still trying to maintain his cold expression, turned and got into his car. With one final glance, he sped off, leaving behind a feeling of quiet victory. Tom, having captured the entire encounter on his phone, approached Maya. "I'll send this footage to the higher-ups," he said, his voice firm with resolve. Maya nodded, knowing that justice would not be overlooked this time. Carter's silence spoke volumes as he disappeared into the night. Merely muttering something inaudible, Carter started his car and drove away, leaving behind a tense silence that seemed to linger in the air. Tom stepped closer to Maya, holding his phone firmly. "This video will serve as clear evidence," he said. "I'll send it to the police department and the press if necessary." Maya nodded, her gratitude evident. She knew that the truth had been captured, and that she was not alone in this fight. For Maya it was a victory, albeit a bittersweet one. She recognized that Carter's actions stemmed from a deeper truth he could not face. Though he still held a position of authority, his confidence had been irreparably shaken. Mark stood beside Maya, both of them enveloped in a heavy silence. He understood the significance of this moment, not just for Maya, but for the entire community they served. Maya didn't need to say anything further. Everything was clear. She wasn't just defending herself. She was standing up for all those who had been silenced by discrimination and prejudice. However, Carter's departure didn't mark the end of the ordeal. The video, recorded by a bystander during the confrontation, began circulating on social media. The entire tense exchange, Carter's prejudiced demeanor, Maya's resolute defiance, was now on full display. The footage was undeniable evidence of the racism Carter had exhibited, and it struck a chord with viewers. As the video spread rapidly, it began to garner widespread attention, particularly among those who had experienced similar injustices. Maya quickly became a symbol of courage and resilience. For many, she represented the determination to challenge systemic discrimination, not only for herself, but for everyone who had been marginalized. Her unwavering stance inspired those who had been too afraid to confront prejudice, showing them that change was possible if they stood firm and spoke out. Meanwhile, the reaction to Carter's actions was swift and unforgiving. The video sparked outrage, and public demand for accountability grew louder by the hour. The very next day, media outlets ran articles condemning Carter's behavior, highlighting his unprofessionalism and the blatant racism he had displayed. Community members, activists, and even public officials joined the call for strict disciplinary action. Carter found himself under immense pressure, unable to evade the consequences of his actions. As public scrutiny intensified, Carter was summoned to meet with his superiors. His colleagues, some of whom had previously turned a blind eye to his behavior, began to question his ethics and professionalism. The ripple effects of his actions were undeniable, forcing the department to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic issues within their ranks. Maya, although she hadn't sought the attention, found herself at the center of a movement. Strangers reached out to her with messages of support, sharing their own experiences with racism and thanking her for her bravery. The outpouring of solidarity was overwhelming, yet Maya remained composed. She understood that this moment wasn't about personal accolades, but about the larger fight for justice and equality. This was just the beginning of a long and arduous journey. Determined to use this momentum for change, Maya refused to let the incident fade into obscurity. The confrontation had exposed a critical issue, and she was resolved to ensure that it led to meaningful reform. She knew the battle was far from over, and that complacency would only allow prejudice to persist. The next morning, Maya walked into a meeting at the police department. Her steps were steady, her gaze unwavering. She stood before her colleagues, her voice firm. "We need change," she began. "Behaviors like Carter's not only harm the community, but also erode the trust that law enforcement depends on to serve effectively." Her words resonated, drawing nods and affirmations from her peers. The incident had become a catalyst for a deeper conversation about accountability and reform, marking a pivotal turning point. As Maya left the meeting, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was daunting, but she was not deterred. She knew that the fight against prejudice and injustice required relentless effort and the courage to challenge deeply ingrained systems of power. In the flickering light of dawn, she found strength, not only in her own resolve, but in the unity of those who stood beside her. The video of the confrontation continued to circulate, reaching wider audiences and sparking debates about systemic racism and the need for institutional change. For Maya, the moment was no longer just about one individual's misconduct. It had become a rallying cry for a broader movement, a demand for justice, equality, and accountability. She drove home in silence that evening, her thoughts a mix of reflection and determination. All night, Maya's confrontation with Carter replayed in her mind, every word and action cutting deeply into her heart. She couldn't escape the heavy question that lingered. Was racism within the police force an unchangeable reality? Could she truly challenge and transform a system that had existed, unyielding, for so long? She glanced out the window, her reflection in the rearview mirror staring back at her, a face lined with determination yet weighed down by the burden of her thoughts. She had won a battle that day, but she knew the fight was far from over. This wasn't just about Carter or one incident. It was a struggle she would face every day. It wasn't just for her own sake, but for the sake of all those who had been oppressed, discriminated against, and treated unjustly. Every moment of the confrontation was a painful reminder of the power imbalances that permeated law enforcement. But rather than letting it defeat her, it ignited a fire within her, a steadfast resolve to keep moving forward. Maya knew that meaningful change required patience, commitment, and an unwavering belief in her cause. She would transform her pain and frustration into motivation, rising above the obstacles to serve as a role model for those who looked to her for guidance and inspiration. As she inhaled the cool evening air, Maya resolved to be a shining example of integrity and resilience, not only for her colleagues, but for those who continued to suffer in silence. Her actions and determination would light the way for others, illuminating the path toward justice and equality. The next morning, Maya stepped into an important meeting at the police department. Senior leaders had gathered to discuss the need for reform within the force. Clad in her neatly pressed uniform, Maya entered with a presence that commanded attention. Her eyes, brimming with determination, made it clear that she was not there to merely observe, but to lead. As she walked in, the room fell silent, her resilience and strength palpable. Maya was more than just an officer that day. She was a force for change. When it was her turn to speak, she rose with unwavering conviction, her voice steady and clear. "We are facing an undeniable reality," she began, her words cutting through the silence. "Our police department has deep-rooted issues with racism and injustice. This is not just about what happened to me. These issues infiltrate every strategy, every decision, every patrol. It's time we acknowledge that change is not optional, it is necessary. And it must start now." Her words carried the weight of experience and the power of truth. Maya spoke not from theory or abstract ideals, but from lived reality. The room hung on her every word as she continued, her tone unyielding but hopeful. "We cannot normalize events like these," Maya declared. "To truly protect justice and serve our communities, we must change how we operate. Transparency and respect are not ideals to strive for, they are necessities. We must treat every individual with dignity, regardless of their race, gender, or social status." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The silence in the room was heavy with reflection. "I am committed to this fight," she continued. "Racism, discrimination, and poor decision-making cannot go unchecked. I will not back down, and I hope you will join me on this journey to create a better, more equitable force." The room remained silent for a moment before a soft round of applause began to build. The applause grew stronger, filling the space with a sense of unity and purpose. Maya acknowledged it with a small, gentle smile, but inside, she felt something deeper, a sense of peace and resolve. She knew the battle was far from over, but this moment marked a step forward, a new beginning. Maya had stood up not only for herself, but for everyone who had been disrespected, silenced, or forgotten. She knew she wasn't alone in this fight, and that she would continue to lead the charge toward a fairer, more equitable society. Her story was not just about one confrontation. It was about courage, resilience, and the power to inspire change. Maya proved that even in the face of doubt and adversity, one person could rise to set an example for future generations. She had become more than a police officer. She was a beacon of hope and a relentless advocate for justice. By standing her ground, she showed others that change was possible and that every voice mattered in the fight against discrimination. Maya's journey was far from over, but she would carry her resolve forward, determined to make the world a better, more just place for all.